It's easy at this time of year, with the story of the birth of Christ, and especially all the embellishments that men put on that story, they're saying, oh, come let us adore Him. You know, a little baby, what a beautiful thing, let's adore Him. And let me tell you, a lot of people put a lot more adoration on the baby Jesus at Christmas time than they do on the adult Jesus for the rest of the year. You see, this Jesus speaks with authority. And if we're going to really honor Christ, we're going to respect His authority. And that doesn't get the attention throughout the rest of the year. Jesus met with opposition in His time on this earth. And it's because He had authority that He met with opposition. And it's because of the authority of Christ that He meets with opposition today. And as we look at the lesson this morning, it's the time in the book of Mark where Jesus begins to meet with some opposition. Now, this story is found 3 times in the New Testament, and I think it would be good to look at all 3 times. Turn in the book of Mark, and right now just let me read to you, and you follow in the Bible. Look at Mark chapter 2. It's the first 12 verses. I'm going to begin with the last part of the last verse of Mark chapter 1 and then read down there through these 12 verses about this story. And it's a story you're very familiar with, all right? And it's where Jesus begins to meet some opposition in the book of Mark. You see, let me tell you that Mark doesn't talk about the birth of Jesus at all. You find that in Matthew and you find that in Luke. And Mark doesn't even address it. But he starts off with Jesus the Christ speaking the word with authority. And they recognize that He had the authority. And then it's going to talk about this authority again here. Watch how this works. Mark chapter 1:45, the last part of that, it said, well, just verse 45. It began to be published much and to blaze abroad the matter, inasmuch that Jesus could no more openly enter into the city, but was without in the desert places, and they came to Him from every quarter. And again He entered into Capernaum and said, and after some days it was noised abroad that He was in the house. And straightway many were gathered together, inasmuch as there was no room to receive Him, no, not so much as about the door. And He preached the word unto them. And they come unto Him, bringing one sick of the palsy, which was born of 4. And when they could not come nigh unto Him for the press, they uncovered the roof where He was, and when they had broken it up, they let down the bed wherein the sick of palsy lay. When Jesus saw their faith, He said to the sick of palsy, Son, thy sins be forgiven thee. But there were certain of the scribes sitting there, and reasoned in their hearts, Why doth this man thus speak blasphemies? Who can forgive sin but God only? And immediately when Jesus perceived in His spirit that they so reasoned within themselves, He said unto them, Why reason ye these things in your hearts? Whether it is easier to say to the sick of the palsy, Thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, Arise, take up thy bed and walk. But that ye may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins. He said to the sick of palsy, I say unto thee, Arise, take up thy bed, and go thy way into thine house. And immediately he arose, took up the bed, and went forth before them all, inasmuch as they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, We never saw it in this fashion. Well, I said I was going to read Luke and Matthew. Luke and Matthew both tell about this. I don't think I'll read that right now, but here's what you do. You take this passage and then you go over and turn to Luke 5:17 through 26. You'll read pretty much the same thing. You see, Luke came along later and searched these things out. Sometimes you read this, and boy, they tell you all this stuff. Wouldn't it be good if someone came and checked it out to see if it was all so? And that's what Luke did. He came and talked to those that were there and searched these things out diligently. He said, yeah, here's the story. And Luke writes it after he checked it all out. And then Matthew may have been there. Matthew's one of the apostles of Christ. It's interesting. You read the story of Matthew. Is that Matthew tells this? He doesn't tell it just like Mark does. And Matthew leaves out entirely the part about the men taking the roof away and letting the man down. Matthew doesn't mention that. That's not the main focus of the story. But that is told by Mark, and it is told by Luke. Let's get back into this. I'm going to take it verse by verse and point out some high points. You'll see them. I've got them yellowed in the text, and we'll see some of the high points in regard to this. Jesus had been baptized of John, and immediately he went into the wilderness where he was tempted of the devil and was with the wild beasts. But he came back and he was preaching the same message John preached. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And the people were amazed at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority. And he would do miracles. Right there in the synagogue, a man possessed with a demon. He commanded the demon to depart from him, and he departed. And people were coming from all over to see Jesus with all manner of infirmities, and he was healing them all. And so it got to where he couldn't even come to town, not openly, and people would go out of town into the countryside and the wilderness where Jesus was to be with him. And that's where this story comes. That's Mark chapter 1. Now Mark chapter 2. He comes back into Capernaum unannounced. And he goes into the house. And again he entered into Capernaum after some days, and it was noised that he was in the house. Well, the house he had been going in, according to Mark chapter 1, was the house of Peter. Probably the same house. He's gone back and he's in Peter's house. And here's what happens in verse 2. Straightway many were gathered together, inasmuch as there was no room to receive them, no, not so much as about the door. And he preached the word to them. Word got out. He's back. He's back at Peter's house. From all over Capernaum, they're telling the word, and they all gather around that house, and they're pressing in. And so I want you to imagine the scene. I'm not an artist. I have seen where artists have painted pictures of Bible scenes. I think the first little Bible I had pictures of Bible stories in it. And when I was too young to really read the stories, I'd look at the pictures. And every now and then those pictures deceived me. They put things in there that weren't really biblical. But the pictures would tell me the story. In fact, before people were very literate and they couldn't read and they weren't taught to read, that's really where all these stained glass windows and all came from. It's kind of like, you might think of them as very expensive and permanent bulletin boards. Preachers would show up at the church and preach the story off the stained glass window that was there, that was depicted by that, explaining the pictures, you know. If I could paint a picture of this scene, here's how I would paint it. I want you to imagine you're there. You're in one of these houses. And those old houses, listen, they didn't have LED lights, you know, to brighten this place up. And you take one of these little houses, if they had a window at all, it was probably small. And now everyone's all gathered around that house, and the room is filled, and it's kind of dark in there, wouldn't it? It would be. Even in the daytime, it would have been dark in that house with no lights in the house, or very dim lights, and filled with people, and people gathered all around and looking through the windows and all about the door. You couldn't have got much light in that house. And in the middle of this dark house, there's Jesus. But now, in the painting, the roof would be taken away. Maybe I could paint part of the roof and show the men looking down. You know, the four men that brought the paralytic man, they're looking down in the roof. and the light comes through the roof. That's how I'd paint it. The light's coming through the roof, and in the middle of this dark house, the light is shining on Jesus. And so that'd be the center of the picture. And then they have let the man down, and the light shining on Jesus and on the man that is lying there before him on that cot where they had let him down through the roof. And that's the focus of attention. And everyone is looking at Jesus and the man on the cot. But just outside the light, just in the shadows, I'd show some men, the scribes they're called here, and they're there, and they don't have good looks on their faces. They don't really like what they're seeing. They're sitting there like they're taking up more room than they should have taken. And the house is filled, and they're sitting just outside the light and the shadows with those looks that look like, I don't like what I'm seeing here. Now that's how I would paint that picture, and that is this scene. And so, Jesus is preaching the Word to them. That was Jesus' focus, to preach the Word. When He performed miracles, the very miracles themselves are to confirm the Word that He preached. When Moses came to deliver the children of Israel out of Egypt, God gave Moses the ability to do signs and wonders that the people might know and the king, Pharaoh, might know Moses is sent from God. When the prophets went about preaching their prophecies, you read about Elijah and Elisha. What did they do? They did miraculous wonders. Well, I made an axe head to float. Well, why would they do things like that? It was because wanted the people to know these men are here from God. And that's what Jesus does when He performs miracles. His purpose is to preach the Word. The miracles are there to confirm the things that He preaches. Later, when He sends the apostles into all the world to preach the gospel, these signs follow them that believe, so people would know it came from God. But Jesus is preaching the Word, and we'd already read in Mark chapter 1, He spake with authority and not as the scribes. The scribes are sitting there. They know that. All right. And they come to Him bringing one sick of palsy. Now, we're not sure exactly what this palsy was, but we can tell whatever this was, the man couldn't walk. He was confined to his bed. So some disease, some problem the man had, they call it palsy. And he couldn't come see Jesus. He's got 4 friends that bring him to Jesus. Now, you talk about good friends. That is good friends. You know, we might be good friends and carry someone to the hospital if they need to go, or get them to the doctor. You want to be a real good friend, then bring someone to Jesus. And then this is the story I remember from Sunday school. Verse 4. In fact, I think my mother was teaching the class. She took a piece of a little cardboard, like a little shoebox or something, and fixed it where you could take off part of the top. And she cut the holes in it and all this kind of panorama. And she'd sit it in a sandbox and make little figures out of, what do you call them? The pipe cleaners? Is that what it was? The pipe cleaner men? And she reenacted this story in this little sandbox. And you know, as a little boy, I'd sit there and watch that like it was really happening. You Sunday school teachers teaching children, that has stayed in my mind. I think it was my mother that did it because she taught like that, but I don't remember my mother teaching it. I sure do remember that story. And you teachers teaching children in these little classes, you are making impressions on them that is going to stay with them all their life. That's so important. And so, I was watching that little story, and this was the lesson I learned. But it says, when they could not come nigh to the press, they uncovered the roof where he was, and when they broken it up, they let down the bed wherein the sick of palsy lay. And when Jesus saw thy faith, He said to the sick of palsy, Son, thy sins be forgiven thee. Now here's the story. I remember the lesson. Where there's a will, there's a way. You see, it'd been so easy for these 4 fellas to say, well, too bad you can't see Jesus, you can't walk, we'll go and we'll tell you about Him. No, They said, we're going to take you. And then they get there and they're pressed about the door. When it says that they could not come nigh unto him for the press. Okay, that's not the news media press. That's all the people pressed against the door. We're never going to get into that house. We brought him all this way and we can't go see him. But where there's a well, there's a way. Somebody said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to let him down through the roof. So they went to all the trouble to get that man in that cot up on the roof, and they started tearing the roof away, and they got him to Jesus. Where there is a will, there is a way. You know, also, if you don't want to do something, you can find an excuse not to. You don't realize, you'll find an excuse. I was telling a story this morning today about these two fellas out fishing one Sunday morning, out in their little boat fishing. One of them said to the other, you know, I really should have been at church this morning. And the other fella's out there fishing. He says, yeah, you know, I really should have been too, but I couldn't have gone anyway. My wife is sick. Well, people use any excuse, don't they? If they don't want to go, they'll find a reason not to go. But a little poem from Edgar Guest about where there's a will, there's a way. It went like this. Somebody said that it couldn't be done, but he with a chuckle replied that maybe it couldn't, but he would be one that wouldn't say so till he tried. So he buckled right in with a bit of a grin on his face. If he worried, he hit it. And he started to sing as he tackled the thing that couldn't be done, and he did it. We can always do what God wants us to do. And you have to rip the roof off the house to do it. You can do it. And that was the lesson I learned in Sunday school. But that's not the main lesson. You see, Matthew didn't even mention this. Jesus did say in this regard, he saw their faith. How do you see faith? Well, James said, you show me your faith without your works, I'll show you my faith by my works. He saw their faith by what they did. Their faith was demonstrated. And so he saw their faith, and then he said, son, thy sins be forgiven thee. Now that's not what everyone expected him to say. Now he expected them to heal him. That's why they brought him. They knew he'd heal him. But this introduces a whole new aspect. First, that word son. He's going to use that word again in a minute, son of man, and that's the word son. But this word son is a more tender word. It's like child. You child? It's a very tender term with which he's speaking to this man. He says, son. And why did he say thy sins be forgiven thee? Now, we don't really know the story about this palsied man. Was he afflicted like this because of some sin that had been in his life? Well, it could have been. Or was he maybe associating the fact, oh, now I can't even walk, and it's reminding him of all his sins? Well, sometimes the problems in life do that. Whatever it was, Jesus knew that the spiritual condition needed to be addressed first. And so he comforted the young man. Son, thy sins be forgiven thee. Well, the scribes heard it. Certain of the scribes sitting there, and they're reasoning in their hearts. Now, they don't say anything, but they must have knew how each other thought, and they're thinking this together. They may have been looking at each other. You hear that? You hear that? And they're thinking this. And Jesus knew what they were thinking. You see, that's one of the evidences we have that this Jesus is the Christ. He could do what man couldn't do. He knows what we're thinking. And he knew what they were thinking. It says he perceived in his spirit. Now, these guys were thinking, nobody can do this but God only. This is blasphemy. Jesus knew they were thinking that. And so Jesus responds, why reason ye within yourself these things in your hearts? Whether it is easier. Okay, let me say that. What's the easiest thing to say? What'd be easier for me to say? Thy sins be forgiven thee? Or say to the sick of palsy, thy sins be forgiven thee? Or say, arise, take up thy bed and walk? but that you may know. Now you see how the miracle is going to demonstrate the authority? That ye may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins. Jesus called himself the Son of Man. It's a term of humility. He's in the flesh. He's like we are in the flesh. Mark is writing, Mark 1:1, that we might know that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus wants us to know He's also the Son of Man. He is God in the flesh. None can forgive sins but God only. That's true. But now here's the Son of Man. Here's a man. It's God in man. And that's what we're going to get out of this. The Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins. Jesus saw their faith by what they did to get that man to Jesus. And now they are going to see His authority. He had been speaking with authority, and now you're going to see His authority by what the palsied man is about to do. That you may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins. He saith to the sick of palsy, I say to thee, arise, take up thy bed, and go to thy house. And here it is. It says, immediately he arose, took up the bed, and went forth before them all, inasmuch as they were all amazed. And they glorified God. See, they knew. They knew this is of God. And whether they were able to put all this together, that Jesus was God in the flesh or not, maybe that was too much for them to comprehend at this time. But if none can forgive sins but God only, and Jesus says this Son of Man has power on earth to forgive sins, so arise and take up thy bed and walk. Now they knew that. And they glorified God. They made some connection here between what Jesus was doing and the authority of God Himself. And they said, we never saw it after this fashion. They had never seen anything like this. They had seen men healed before, but they'd never seen a man say, I can forgive you of your trespasses by the power of God. So take up thy bed and walk. And they knew this was different. Now, we keep reading, and we're going to understand that Jesus is God. He's God in the flesh. We're going to read about it in the epistles. Paul's going to write to the Colossians in Colossians 2:9. In Him dwelleth all the fullness of the Godhead. And we're going to read about it in the book of Hebrews in an expression. We won't have time to explore the depths of this, but it says in Hebrews 1:3 that He is the express image of His person. That is, Jesus is the express image of God's person. And we're going to understand that Jesus is God. And that's why Mark writes this. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Mark 1:1. And Mark telling this story in this context, in this circumstance, as he did, that's part of the evidence. And Luke backs him up. And Matthew writes that, yeah, I was there. Mark got that right. And so here's a miracle, unlike anything the world had ever seen, performed before many witnesses, right in the presence of the skeptical scribes that could not deny a glorious thing had been done. With evidence like this, how could it be that people do not believe that Jesus is the Christ? They're not looking at the evidence. They think it's a bunch of fairy tales, but it's not told like a fairy tale. It's collaborated by other witnesses. We have reasons to believe, thanks to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I want to end the lesson this way. They saw His authority, His power, by what He did. Jesus saw their faith by what they did. So has Jesus seen your faith? If you want to show Jesus your faith, you show Him your faith by what you do. Jesus said, "He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved." Do you believe it? You believe it? Don't tell me you believe it. Show Jesus your faith and do it. So with that, I extend the invitation. If you believe, show us your faith by your work. Show by what you do. And let Jesus see your faith. Become obedient to Him in baptism. You'll come up out of that water. And Jesus says, "Thy sins be forgiven thee." So there's the invitation if you want to come forward this morning as we stand and sing.